location to be joining you from today, which is I'm in my home territory, so in Musqueam, which is Vancouver. We also share with our Hul'qumi'num speaking relatives, Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish. So for me, it's always good to be able to ground myself in a strong way in my own territorial roots. I also wanted to acknowledge the different territories that everyone else is going to be joining from. And given that this is virtual, I imagine that we're all over the province for a lot of us. And I'm deeply grateful that you're able to join. And I'm really, really grateful for the presenters that we have joining us today. As everyone is aware, we have a number of tables moving into closing. And I think this is a really good way for us to continue to share knowledge, to build connections, to build capacity. And again, as the Commission has the ability to convene such a wide variety of perspectives, those that have direct experience in this process, as well as moving into ratification processes. So Haichka to the panel, Haichka to the participants, Haichka to the staff that has made this happen and everyone making themselves available. And I really wanted to also acknowledge Canada for supporting our virtual roundtable, kicking us off today, as well as Angela for, I'm going to be handing it over to you in your capable hands to be facilitating. I probably will go off camera and I will end up going into our boardroom, but again, I'm just really looking forward to the discussion and the participation from the participants, and really looking forward to drawing out some of the best practices, but also the Q&A. I think that's going to be integral to helping the Commission support tables in your respective negotiations.
Great, thank you very much, Chief Commissioner Celeste. Always appreciate that and echo those words of appreciation to all for also joining on. We have had these conversations at our tables. As Celeste was saying, a lot of tables are indicating sort of that desire to start speaking to one another again as you move into the more in-depth engagement activities that you're going to have as you move through the negotiation process. So I know, having gone through it, as many others around the table here today that are joining us have gone through this process. We've had some really great success through the Commission in doing some of these virtual roundtables, being able to gather people, connect, make networks. And I think that's one of the bigger parts of it, is to know that you're not in this alone. I know, being a citizen from Monmouth and somebody who went through this process with our communities, how great it is to be able to lean on colleagues sometimes, to be able to look to others' experiences to help us out. And always grateful that modern treaty nations have got a philosophy of paying it forward. So really great to see people like Val and Kim here today, and Grace and others who continue to do that kind of work and to support others that are continuing along the way. None of us have the answers, but we certainly have experiences that we can share. And each of you in your communities is going to have your own challenges, your own opportunities, your own experiences, but being able to share that often takes a little bit of the load off. So really thank you all for joining. We have a number of tables joining us today. I think there's at least 11 of our treaty negotiation tables who've joined us. So welcome to all of you. We have participants from Canada and British Columbia, our colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us. And Canada will actually be presenting today. British Columbia is here observing as well, and can be available to respond to questions or to take those back if you would like. Just acknowledging our team again, Dean, and all of those who helped you to pull this together. Really grateful for all of that. Part of what the team did in gathering and preparing for this forum was to ask all of you if you had any specific questions. I had a bit of an opportunity to look through those, and really glad to see that to a large degree we've got some excellent resource people that have come to join us. And I want to say special thank you to all those presenters that we're going to hear from today. You've got tremendous experience to share with us, and we're really looking forward to that. So some of the things that people have brought up in terms of the challenges that they're facing, or things that they're hoping to learn today, Just basically general background. We got some comments from people on what is E&E, what are the timelines, how does the funding work, when do we need to start doing this work, who gets involved. So I think we've got some great presenters lined up to answer those kind of questions. A lot of questions around just communications and community engagement. How do we reach our people who live away from home, including those who live out of Canada? How does all of that work? And I think there's a chance to start talking about that today and to continue those discussions as we move on. We've also had some roundtables before. Stephanie from our office helped me with one of the virtual forums on communication. So there's some great recorded information that's available to you as well. Preparing for the votes, everybody's really thinking about how we prepare ourselves for that. Everybody's really interested in hearing from other First Nations about what kind of experiences they've had in E&E in terms of communication, setting yourselves up, the kind of technical aspects of that, what kind of software and databases do you use? Those are some really deep questions, but we can get into those as time goes on as well. And really a couple of comments about involving the youth. And I just want to really underline and emphasize how important that is to involve our young people at this stage, because it makes a huge difference. And I think you'll hear that from some of our presenters as well today. So that's my brief introduction as we go through. So we're going to have 3 panels today, and really appreciate those again who have stood forward to make presentations. We're going to start off with a presentation from Canada that talks more just about what is E&E, what are the processes, just to sort of set context for what it is that we're looking at. And thank you to Michael and Gerald who will make that first presentation. I would like to welcome our panel from Canada. I understand that Michael Horvath will be doing the first part of the presentation, followed by Gerald Chan. So Michael, without further ado, over to you.
Hi, can everyone hear me all right? Wonderful. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for having us here in the BCTC offices. It's a real privilege to be speaking to you today from this location, and thank you, Celeste, for the introduction. So I'm Michael Horvath, and I'm a policy analyst with Crown Indigenous Relations, and my main role is supporting the negotiation teams, the federal negotiators in BC. And this morning, I'm going to start off by talking about the federal interests in the eligibility and enrollment chapter. And in the second half, my colleague from our fiscal branch, Gerald Chan, will talk about the funding that goes along with eligibility and enrollment. And before I get into the next slide, I think it's worth noting to keep in mind, this presentation is best viewed as a snapshot of Canada's eligibility and enrollment interests at this time. And the federal approach to the chapter may continue to evolve with our conversations with yourselves and Canada's Indigenous partners across the country. So we can go into the slide. What is the eligibility and enrollment chapter? Why is it there, and what does it help us achieve? The main role of the chapter is to help determine who is eligible to be enrolled in the treaty, and define who may participate in the ratification vote. It really speaks to the group of people who hold the rights in the treaty. And when when we use these terms, eligibility, we're really talking about who may enroll under the treaty, and enrollment is the administrative process of registering eligible people. And enrollees or beneficiaries are people who have become enrolled under the treaty through that administrative process. So Canada's key interest in the E&E chapter is supporting Indigenous self-determination. And it's really important to acknowledge how Indigenous peoples define and govern themselves as nations. And we want to consider how we implement these definitions in cooperative agreements like treaties. So Canada will seek to intervene as little as possible so that the treaty reflects the nation's view of its identity. And in the enrollment process, Canada's objective is to leave as much control over that process to Indigenous nations as possible. Another key interest is the predictable exercise of rights, and really about who is exercising those rights. So the federal interest here is thinking about people who have a reasonable claim to belong to a rights holding collective, and think about whose rights might be impacted by the treaty. And here it's very helpful to lay this out in an agreement so that everyone has that common understanding of who might be exercising those rights. And that's what the E&E chapter helps clarify. Of course, we want a durable agreement, something that can withstand legal challenges. We want the agreements to be able to stand the test of time. And to do that, we look to provide an opportunity for individuals who might have their rights impacted by the treaty, give them a chance to enroll and vote in the ratification process. So people whose rights might be affected by the treaty include band members, people who are eligible to be band members, and people who are part of the Section 35 collective. Having criteria that are fair and fairly applied also help with the durability of the agreement. And Canada looks for an enrollment process that's transparent and impartial and has a right of appeal. Having eligibility criteria that are clear help the enrollment committee give notice to people who are potentially eligible, and a clearly documented enrollment process is a good support in case challenges arise to the validity of the agreement. And of course, an affordable and cost-effective enrollment process is desired. There's a few other considerations from Canada's side in the E&E chapter, and one of the standout ones there is related to dual enrollment. Canada here is looking to have kind of one person enrolled under one agreement at a time, trying to avoid enrollment in two treaties or a band in a treaty at the same time. Even in a treaty with multiple First Nations, Canada would be looking to have people enroll with one of the treaty nations at a time. So that's something that is present in the Manolth Agreement, for example. Now that said, it is possible to withdraw your enrollment from one agreement and enroll in another treaty. And there's an example of that process in the Manolth Agreement as well. So there's a few eligibility criteria that's typically supported by Canada. And this is kind of arrived at when thinking about the federal interests and considerations. And these criteria help us achieve some of the objectives stated, like ensuring a smooth transition away from the Indian Act and ensuring that that opportunity is provided, having people who might have a claim to the rights of the group, they have a chance to enroll and participate in the ratification vote. But I do note that the criteria here, ancestry, being a descendant, being part of the ban list, adoptees, and so on, it's a typical set. It's not a prescriptive set. It's not an exhaustive menu. Canada is able to co-develop a set of criteria that reflects your nation's view on who belongs to your nation. So there are, as an example of something that Canada might support in addition to this set of criteria is a kind of a demonstrated attachment or a community attachment type of criteria, and one where somebody might have to show an objective link between themselves and a community. So I said that the key interest for Canada in this chapter is supporting Indigenous self-determination. And where do we see that? We see that in the co-development process regarding the eligibility criteria, something that is done together between Canada and First Nations. And First Nations also lead on the enrollment process. Typically, the First Nation appoints enrollment committee representatives, and that enrollment committee has quite a big role in registering eligible individuals and really makes the key determinations on whether someone meets the eligibility criteria or not. And if there are challenges about whether someone should or should not be eligible for the treaty, there's an enrollment appeal board that has representatives appointed by both the First Nation and Canada, but I know that that board can have a majority of appointees from the First Nation, or sorry, appointed by the First Nation. And after the effective date, First Nations set up their own process for making decisions on enrollment applications. And there's a new aspect of this chapter that Canada is able to include to help support self-determination, and really recognizing the evergreen nature of modern treaties under the RRR policy. So what this new ability is an amendment process, one where parties can negotiate how eligibility criteria might change after effective date. So this is a little different than a First Nation making laws about the definition of eligibility criteria, or the enrollment application process after effective date. This amendment process could change some of the eligibility criteria itself in the treaty, and it's a process that could be led by the treaty nation. So Canada has a template about what that might look like, and if you asked your federal negotiator, I'm sure they'd be able to give you some information and share that template. But it is just a template. It's one of many possible ways that parties could co-develop, but it is something new, and in an effort to continue to support self-determination. And that's the first half here, our review of the federal interests in the chapter. So I'll turn it over to Gerald.
Hello, everyone. This is Gerald Chan. I'm the manager of fiscal negotiations for Canada. I'm happy to be here to share some information about eligibility enrollment funding. I think, on funding, on eligibility enrollment, Canada and BC, we provide some funding to support the process for members to vote on the establishment of a constitution, which sometimes happen a little bit of time before the ratification process typically, but the I guess the materials as developed for the vote on the establishment of the Constitution can be updated and used to support the ratification for the final agreement. So there's funding that Canada and BC can provide in a kind of a cost-sharing arrangement. In terms of the process, typically Canada and BC would put together an offer for eligibility enrollment presented jointly to the First Nation. And in terms of the funding that's provided and what does it cover. So eligibility enrollment is intended to support establishment of enrollment committee, enrollment appeal board, honoraria for committee members, certain travel that's involved for enrollment committee and staff, temporary staffing for enrollment coordinator, certain administrative expenses associated with the enrollment process, communication costs, and office costs. So eligibility enrollment funding is contribution funding, and there's a requirement for a work plan to be put together. And we have, templates for work plan that I could pull up onto the screen at the end of this presentation to kind of illustrate what are some of the items that would be useful to capture in a work plan. Timing. There's some flexibility with regards to timing of when the funding would flow for eligibility enrollment, but the main purpose is for it to be in time to carry out the process of enrollment, determining eligibility in time for the ratification vote. The steps leading to the flowing of the funding, Canada, BC would prepare an offer, and then after the acceptance of the offer, Canada internally would commit the funding, and then the funding would flow. We would typically flow it through our Indigenous Services Canada colleagues because they have existing master funding agreements that we can fairly easily amend and include the eligibility enrollment funding. And typically funding provided near the conclusion of negotiations and cover enrollment committee, enrollment appeal board until effective date, at which point governance funding will take over. There's also really, after the nation has ratified the agreement, there's also additional funding between ratification date and effective date, which we call self-government startup funding. So funding for self-government startup can also help to any additional activities during that period from ratification to effective date, any kind of governance, startup, establishment related activities. So this is a template of a work plan. So the work plan would indicate certain activities that's anticipated during a certain time frame. I guess specify purpose of the activity, the intention of the nation to hire, train a coordinator for day-to-day functions, collecting, recording data, organizing meetings, liaisoning with the nation's administration, assisting in community engagement. And then it sets out certain objectives and the timing of the objectives, the activities that would be required, create job description, roles, responsibility for the coordinator, a job posting, a work plan, hire the coordinator, put out the job posting, hold the interview potentially, train the coordinator, create orientation package. So these would be typically the activities that we envision that the funding from Canada and BC for eligibility enrollment would support. Creating guidelines, terms of reference for the committee, typically 3 members and a chair, where there's a honorarium funding for the committee members, training materials, some information for the committee members, implement a database, engage database specialists to create, modify database, track member information and all communication activity, create procedures, to create procedures and processes for eligibility enrollment, create communication materials on how to enroll, outreach by committee and the coordinator, map out eligible members, creation of materials, booklets. So these are the typical objectives, establishing an appeal board, and then prepare information for ratification committee, to provide a registry of enroll members to ratification committee, and then prepare a final report, compile all relevant information, review final report. So yeah, so this is a bit of a typical activities that we'll be funding. I think we'll hear from Comox and Kissilis later today, and we've provided some funding for their ongoing processes for enrollment eligibility, and I think the funding that's typically provided from Canada and BC, and it's cost shared between Canada, BC on a 60-40 basis. Canada providing 60%, BC providing 40%. And I think the estimate, typically, I think the funding we provide for eligibility enrollment has been approximately, $400,000 to $450,000. That's approximately. So just to give nations a bit of a kind of a ballpark figure, what to expect in terms of funding, and also the activities that typically would be funded, and the activities could take place, from within like a 1 to 2 year time frame, depending on how complicated the process is.
Thanks very much, Gerald and Michael, for your presentations. I just want to open up the floor. It was a good presentations to set the context for conversations going forward, and hopefully started to answer or maybe even create some more questions for those of you who have been contemplating this going forward on some of these complex issues, and do our best to make sure that there's good communication around these issues, as especially those of you getting advanced in your negotiations go forward. So we hope that this is all helpful to you, and look forward to further discussions as we go on.